Welcome to how to build your first mobile application using React Native in 45 minutes. A brief history. React Native sort of came off as a brainchild project from the ever so successful front-end framework, or rather say library, React. Uses very similar principles and can be used to build really cool and fast applications. And as the title senses itself, it has native, that means React Native, so it interacts with the native backend or the API of your mobile phone using the concept of bridges. Bridges basically act as, well, ideally a bridge between your JavaScript code as well as your iOS, which is your Objective-C/Swift code, or your Java code for, an Apple phone or an Android phone, respectively. Alright, let's get straight into it. We will be using something called Node and Npm. Now, Node is basically this amazing engine that was created way back the late 2000s. It was derived from the V8 engine. Now, not going too specific into these things, but the V8 engine is basically what helps drive Chrome. So Chrome, which is a browser of my choice, is basically run by this engine. You can literally think of an engine as something that takes in petrol and causes movement. In this case, the V8 engine goes ahead and takes in code, and just let's assume, for the simplicity's sake, goes ahead and showcases our website. Now, with that being said, before it was isolated to the Chrome, but then that got extracted so that we can actually use Node and the power of JavaScript on our mobile phones as well as our computers or MacBooks or Windows, whatever you own. And then we use also something called NPM, which stands for Node Package Manager. Basically, all NPM is a bunch of cool files or programs written by amazing people. They go ahead and push it up into something called the NPM registry, which is nothing but basically a registry or a file allocation system that goes ahead and keeps all these various tiny little projects, sometimes large projects, open source, written by amazing developers across the world. So what we're going to do is go ahead and download Node, go ahead and follow the installation process that Node gives us, and once we go ahead and install Node to our specific platform, we can then go ahead and interact and use it. Now, like I said, Node is nothing but an engine that goes ahead and lets us execute JavaScript code in our platforms, such as a MacBook or a Windows. I'm using a MacBook in this instance. Alright, we are also going to need something to go ahead and actually edit as well as look at our code. And what we're going to use is something called atom.io. Now, this is independent. You can go ahead and use whatever you'd like. You could use a text editor. You can use Sublime. I just tend to use Atom because that's my preferred choice. Now, Atom is a few megabytes, I think almost 100 megabytes large, so I've already pre-installed it, but it's a rather straightforward and simple installation, so I encourage you to go ahead and install that in your specific and respective platforms. Now, once we've done this, we're going to go ahead and, in some cases, might be your first time, open up the terminal. Now, you can go ahead and find the terminal by pressing Command and Shift together, which opens up your global search bar, and you can type in terminal, which is terminal, or for those seasoned developers, just go ahead and open your terminal. Now, once we're in our terminal, first thing we're going to do is check whether our installations have gone great, which is we're going to go ahead and type in node space -v, which basically says, can you go ahead and check the Node version? Similarly, we're going to go ahead and do npm space -v, which goes ahead and checks for the npm version. Now, to go ahead and build our application, we're going to use something called create React Native app. Now, you don't need to get too confused or too stressed about that or what it stands for. It basically lets us go ahead and create our application. It creates a boilerplate or a template. A template is basically predefined code that lets us go ahead and follow some basic structure on creating our application. I'll leave a link for you to go ahead and read a little more into create React Native app and how it integrates with something called Expo. Now, I know I'm talking a lot of all these funny words, but I kid you not, it's nothing to stress about. These are just basic jargons that I'm just throwing out there. You don't need to worry too much about it for the first 45 minutes of your awesome application. Now, because I need to go into it, Expo, for those who are aware, is basically the Rails for React Native. Now, what does that mean? Rails is this super cool framework that was created to be used in conjunction with Ruby, which is another language, and that goes ahead and makes everything easy for development by making a lot of tools available for us very, very quickly. So, for example, with Expo, we can go ahead and set up push notifications in a matter of a few clicks, which would usually take a little longer if we're using just React Native. Now, don't get confused, we are still using React Native. It's just that we're using it in conjunction with an umbrella framework, you can think of it as that, which is Expo, to go ahead and ease our use case and ease the production of development. Awesome. Now that we've gone through this, let's go ahead and go to the next lecture where we'll go ahead and install create React Native app. Fantastic. Now that we've gone ahead and installed Node, we would install Atom or Sublime, or using whichever text editor you like. Let's go ahead and install our main process scheme, which lets us utilize and work with React Native. So, go into your terminal and type in npm space install space -g, and I'll explain all this in a second, and then space create React Native app. So what we're saying over here is, hey npm, from the Node package manager registry, up in the air, can you please install a project from your registry called create React Native app, and can you install it globally in my computer? And what installing globally does is it lets us go ahead and use this as a pattern, like an invocation structure. We can then use this as a command to do something. So we install it globally, and this may or may not take time based on the internet speed, so bear with me over here. Cool, so once you've actually had the installation complete, what we need to do is try create the project itself. The first time we're going to go ahead and create the project. Now there are two commands that we need to look into when we're working with the terminal, and this is pretty cool if you're a first-time user. But before we do that, in your MacBook or your computer, go ahead and create a folder where you want your application to be saved. So this can be in your desktop or it can be anywhere else. I saved on my desktop. So the two commands that you need to look into are ls and cd. So ls stands for list and cd stands for change directory, or it's the equivalent of us clicking into a folder or going back from a folder. So if you type in ls in your terminal, it'll show you a list of all the things that are currently present wherever you are in your computer. So what I want to do is navigate to my desktop. Now, in a similar situation where if I could just click through it, I would just click through and go to my desktop. So if we type in ls, you should hopefully see something called desktop. Now all you do is type in cd, which is change directory, and let's change into the desktop, cd space desktop. And right over there, if I type in ls now, you'll see there's a different list. It's because now we are actually in our desktop. And I have a folder over there called Udemy. I'm going to go ahead and cd into Udemy And now that I'm inside Udemy, what I'm going to do is use that globally installed command that we spoke about, which is create React Native app. So just type in create React Native app space and the name of your app. In this case, I'm going to call it my jokes app. So JOKES_app. This is going to take a little bit of time again to install, so bear with me as installation continues. I'll just talk over it for a second. Cool. And as soon as the installation finishes, we basically have options. We'll be given an option to do something called yarn install or yarn start, apologies, or yarn run iOS. So yarn is exactly the same as npm, except it's a little faster. It's literally, it reaches out to the same Node package manager registry to go ahead and install these packages, but of course it has a lot of internal cooler functionalities that we don't need to go into. However, npm's latest version, is actually quite fast, which is npm 5. So if you have npm 5, then good on you for going ahead and utilizing that. But you can also use yarn. It's absolutely almost the same thing, and we don't need to stress about the semantics of these things. Alright, so once the installation finishes, I'll see you in the next one where we're going to go ahead and continue building this awesome app. See you there. Great. So the last lesson, what we did was we went ahead and installed create React Native app, which helps us easily create applications. Now, hopefully you finish your installation process and everything worked out smoothly. So now what we're going to do is try to follow the prompt. In a situation where you don't have yarn installed or yarn is not working for you, we'll stick with npm because npm comes along with the node installation that we did at the very beginning. So you can do npm start. Now that is going to go ahead and execute some code for us, and this will take a little bit of time, based on how quick and slow your computer is. But at the end of it, what we'll end up getting is a huge QR code, and that QR code is what we're actually going to use to go ahead and load our application onto our phone. Yeah, you heard that right. We're going to do that very early on. So in order for us to be able to do that, we'll let these processes do what they're doing. The first thing we're going to go ahead and do is, in our browsers, go to Expo Io. Now, we were there before. If you weren't, that's fine. All you have to do is find the Expo application in your respective Google Play Store or your App Store on your iOS platform. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's go onto our mobile phones, which obviously I can't see right now, or I can't show you mine. Go ahead and in your respective mobile phones, go to the respective app store and try find the Expo app, EXPO. Go ahead and install the application, follow the prompts, it's quite straightforward. Now, once you've gone ahead and installed the application, what I want you to do is open your terminal, the same terminal where you did npm start, and it generated that huge QR code for you, which filled up some bit of my screen. Go into the Expo app on your mobile phone and simply click on search by QR code, which is a prompt that you should see up there after you log in to your Expo app. Alright, now that should open up a camera view for you. All you have to do is point the camera at the QR code, and automatically, if you have your vibration on in your phone, you should feel the vibration, and now you'll end up seeing a bundle loader show up on your terminal, which basically means is, hey, I'm going ahead and compiling this code for you so that it can show up on your mobile phone. Cool. Now, for the ease of this course, I'm not going to go ahead and run everything on my phone because it'd just be a little quirky for us to go through it and share screens. Instead, I'm going to do the command that I did before or we were given a choice of, which is npm run iOS. Now, because I have Xcode installed, I can go ahead and do that. You might or might not have Xcode installed, so in a situation where you want to do something similar, which is I'm going to run a local iOS simulator, you're more than welcome to go ahead and install Xcode. It's quite a straightforward process. It's available in the App Store for your MacBook Pro or MacBook or whichever Mac platform, and then that will give you access to the respective content and application. Go ahead and install it. Awesome. I am going to go ahead and kill this bundle, and I will go ahead and do an npm run iOS, which should load up my simulator. Now, hopefully by now you already have this application loaded up on your phone, and it should show up something that says open up app.js to start working on your app, which is cool. And what that means is just go ahead and wherever you ran this application. In my situation, it was the Udemy folder, which ended up having jokes_app. Go ahead and open that using Atom or Sublime or whichever editor you'd like. You can either do a simple drag and drop onto your Atom icon, you can use your terminal to open it, or you can do whichever process you'd like. You can go to Atom directly and click on File and open the respective project, whichever works for you. Alright, now, so far we had our installation process. From now on is when I'll actually start the timer of making sure I explain as much as I can, as good as I can, about React and React Native and how that works and how we can build our application in 45 minutes. Really, really, really pumped, and I hope you are too. See you there. Awesome. Let's go ahead and open the app in our respective text editors, and once we've opened the application, let's go into our app.js file. You'll notice there are a lot of other files like the .babelrc file, .getignore file, app.json, heaps of files. We don't need to worry about any of those right now. Since we're just jumping into the waters, we're building an app, we're trying to understand how the ecosystem works. Let's go ahead and do app.js as our main focus point. Cool. Now that we've opened app.js, we're shown something, and I know this can be quite scary and confusing for most of us, not all of us. Alright, I'm going to try demystify and explain everything in the best way possible. Now, first line which says import React from React. Now you see it's very literal English in the way it says it. What that basically means is we're going to import from React, R-E-A-C-T. Where is that React coming from? That React is basically coming from, on our left swim panel, if you look on the left side, there's something called node_modules. Now those are the modules, or remember the files that we spoke about that npm gives us? Absolutely, those are those files or modules that we went ahead and installed, or rather Expo did that for us when we did an npm start or a yarn start. So if you open your modules and you scroll all the way down to the part which is R, so J, you will see that there's something called React over there. Now, that is actually what we're importing. Now, on line 2, what we're doing is importing 3 things. It's called the style sheet, text, view, and we're importing this from React Native. Again, this is very similar, just a bunch of code written by the guys and girls at Facebook, and we go ahead and import 3 things. Well, let's call them things for now. Cool. The same way we imported React, which is just another thing or a file or an instance of React from React itself. Cool. Then on line 4 we have this thing called export default class app extends react component. I know that's a lot of words, but won't stress on the most of it. What we're basically doing here is creating a class called app, which goes ahead and extends to something called react.component. Now what does this mean? What this basically means is we're creating a class. What a class is nothing but a template. Now if we go ahead and look at this diagram over here, a class can be basically thought of as a blueprint. A blueprint or a template. It basically acts as a guide to how something should be created as. For example, our parents' DNA is used as a template when we were made. Obviously we get attribute features, but it acts as a template. So we're creating a class called app, which extends something called component or reactor component. Now what that extends basically means in a literal sense is that, hey, let's create this template and let's give it some properties such as, let's go with the basics of name, age, and gender. But let's also go ahead and give it properties from another class. So let's say a typical example would be we go ahead and have something called locomotive. Locomotive could be anything that moves. So we would have attributes or characteristics such as speed or brakes, right? And then we have another class called car, and car can be obviously a subset of locomotion or locomotives, and a car could have anything like doors, you could have mirrors, you can have wheels. We can also have a bike class which can have a number of seats, handle grip. Now those are specific to each thing. So how car has a number of wheels and the doors, but it can also, and most definitely and likely will have, attributes such as speed and brakes. Now it doesn't make sense for us to go ahead and add attributes that will be used across many classes to each and every single one of them. The whole point of programming is to make sure that we're very lazy and we only use code as much as we need. So in instances and situations where we can go ahead and derive, go ahead and pull characteristics from other classes, we can simply do that by extending. Cool. Now that we've done that, we have this thing called render on line 5. What render means is literally what it means. It goes ahead and renders code for us. And on line 6 we have something called return. Now render is a function. A function is nothing but a packet of code that goes ahead and executes itself. Now, we don't need to get too stressed on it. It basically, let's say, walking is a function of a human being. So when we wake up and we want to go to brush our teeth, we invoke the walk function. And that walk function basically, in conjunction with the direction function, goes ahead and takes us to the washroom or bathroom, where we can then go ahead and invoke the brush your teeth function. And each of these functions have bits of code or basic instructions that say, hey, do this, 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 and this. Now, what the return statement basically means is each function either goes ahead and executes something, and that creates a side effect. A simple statement would be if someone went ahead and punched you, the side effect would be either you in pain or you screaming. Let's hope no one punches you. Also, there is a situation where if we do execute a function, we expect a return value. A situation, let's say we have a function that goes ahead and does additions, right? The function's job is literally to go ahead and do 2 plus 2. Cool. So let's call the function 2 plus 2. And when we execute the function, we expect it to return 4, give us the value of 4. Now, without returning it, we don't exactly have access to the value or whatever code our function executed. So returning is an easy or rather obvious way for us to go ahead and tell our function to go ahead and give back whatever is processed. Now, let's look at the general syntax. We have this thing called view. A view is nothing but a container, right? It's used to go ahead and hold other pieces of information, such as text, as we see over here. Now, for beginner's sake, let's go ahead and delete either line 8, 9, or 10, whichever one you want, either of the 3 text elements. I'll go ahead and get rid of the last one. Get rid of it and save the file. So the Mac would do Command S. So once you save the file, if you look at your phone where your app was loaded, you'll see that automatically it's reflected with removing that particular line. Boom, you're left with 2 lines. And that is hot reloading. That's your application live reloading itself to showing you that, hey, we're actually making changes to things as you go ahead and build it. Cool. Now let's go ahead and look into other features and attributes of React and React Native. An object is basically a list of key value pairs. It has a key that has a value, very similar to a dictionary. Each word has a meaning. We use the concept of an object when we're defining something called a state in React. A state is nothing but an object that keeps track of all user interactions with the application. So per se, let's go ahead and assume that we click on a button and the button causes a counter number to increase by 1. That count is maintained by state because it was an interaction that caused that count value to increase by 1. Now, let's go ahead and try implement this so we can understand what's happening. Firstly, let's go ahead and create a state static value in our component. This is static class level value. And in that object, we'll say count equals 0. Next, let's go ahead and import, in line 2, how we've imported style sheet, text, and view. Let's go ahead and import something called Touchable Highlight. So Touchable highlight. A touchable highlight acts as a button. You know how you've seen buttons everywhere in your website or in your application. A touchable highlight is the implementation of a button. So the general clause is when you click on a button, something happens. But we need to be able to track when that click happened, right? So when I click on a button, I want to go ahead and do something. So how do we do that exactly? So the way we do that is straightforward in React Native rather. In between the word touchable highlight and the closing pointy bracket, we'll call it that, you can go ahead and add extra attributes. So what we're checking for is a press. So when we press on the button, we want to go ahead and do something. So we can go ahead and say on press, go ahead and do something, right? Now that something is generally a function. Likewise, that functions are just pockets of code that go ahead and execute a piece of instruction or set of instructions. Now, how do we define a function in a class level? So, without going too deep into it, just understand that this particular class over here can go ahead and contain functions and attributes specific to this class. And the keyword we need to understand is this, THIS. So the keyword this is a very intuitive way in programming to go ahead and say, hey, specific to this particular class or this particular instance, I'm going to go ahead and add a function or an attribute. So let's say with this button, we want to go ahead and create a function that says increase by 1. So I'll go ahead and do increase by 1. Make it a function, which is a function syntax, and then go ahead and for now just log it, or I want to visually see that, you know, when I'm pressing this button, this function is actually being executed. How do we do that? So we do that in JavaScript using console.log. It's just a very straightforward way of logging something onto the screen. It's a way of saying, hey, can you go ahead and print, or can you go ahead and paste or display something onto my screen? Console log is a very straightforward way to go ahead and do that. So for now, we'll just say console.log, and what do we actually want to print or log? For now, we'll just say pressed. And we need to pass it in quotes because we need to give it what we call a string. You know, we have numbers, we have booleans, which are basically true and false. The boolean stands for a true value or a false value, and we have strings, which we have to worry with as well. Awesome. Now we created this function. How do we go ahead and actually execute it when the button is pressed? We can do this by placing in our onPress of the touchable highlight a reference to this particular function. Now, again, this is basically saying we are confining this function to our particular class over here, which is app. So outside of this class, we can go ahead and get access to it if we'd like, but it's confined to its reference is to this particular class itself. Cool. So all we'll do is say this dot increase by 1, and that's it. Awesome. Now if we go ahead and open our application, we may or we may not see the button. What we need to do is give it some styling. Now as you see over here, we've already had something called stylesheet.create. This is React Native's way of going ahead and implementing or adding a style. Like, a style is anything that is visual, it adds the colors, the radiuses, the heights and widths for a particular HTML component, or in our case, a React Native instance or component such as view text. So similar to how this container, let's go ahead and add another attribute called button. And in the button, let's go ahead and give it a width of maybe 100. You can play around with this. Give it a height of around 50. Alright, and then let's go ahead and add another attribute similar to how we added onPress. Add another attribute called style and equate it to the styles.button. Awesome. But we need to give this button some actual, a prompt. Like, a button usually says submit or apply or something of that sort. So let's go ahead and do it in a similar fashion as we did for text and view. We want to give some text. We need to type in something, visually display something for the button. So I'll say text, and we'll go ahead and say submit or increase. Awesome. As soon as you've done that, go ahead and reload the application. If you click on it, now in your logs in your terminal, you should be able to see that particular function being hit.
So now you've gone ahead and got a brief understanding of how this entire ecosystem of React works. It's straightforward to the most of it. So what we're going to do is delete what we've created so far. We'll reuse the concept of it very soon, but what we're first going to do right now is create an input component. Let's firstly actually talk about what we're even building. If we haven't already gone over it, this is basically a jokes application. as we spoke about. It's straightforward. We're going to go ahead and have an input field that lets us go ahead and type any number. That number goes ahead and fetches or gets 10 to 12 or 14, whatever number you put, number of jokes from this endpoint. The endpoint basically being a point on the internet that has some information that we go ahead and gather. And these jokes are then loaded onto a Tinder style swipe card system, and we can just swipe left and right on if we like a joke or don't like a joke. Very nice and fun little application that will definitely get our brains tingling with building new apps. Awesome. Cool. So let's start off. First things first, let's go ahead and create a new folder called components. Now, components are basically elements that go ahead and display UI information. That the job is to go ahead and display UI information and not worry too much about the semantics of things. We usually use a higher level entity called a container for this, but that's beyond the scope. Cool. So now we're making an input component, or rather an input area, because we'll also have our button in this. So let's just, for simplicity, create a folder called input. And now within input, let's go ahead and create a JavaScript file, and let's call that again input.js. Awesome. So we've done that. Next thing, straightforward. Let's go ahead and do things very similar to how it was in the app.js file. I'm going to go ahead and, for the sake of time, go ahead and copy paste these things so that I'm not wasting time typing, because we're doing this in 45 minutes. Sweet. So I'm going to pull over the first line, which is import React as well as component. And the next thing I'm going to go ahead and do is also get access to the style sheet, which we're using to go ahead and create the styles of our application, or make it look pretty rather. Import a text field, because we'll obviously have some text being showcased here and there for our input. A view, remember, a view is basically a container or something that goes ahead and holds our information. We'll also need something called text input, which is basically a component to go ahead and let us type into it some piece of anything that involves us typing. Like in Facebook, when we're typing in a message, that would be ideally a text input. And obviously the last thing is a touchable highlight. That's the equivalent of our button. It's a weird name, definitely. Like basically, I guess, refers to a thing that we can press, because mainly we don't have buttons, or the concept of buttons in, I guess, our application. Button is more of like a CSS, HTML kind of thing. Alright, now let's go ahead and do the class creation and stuff for, like we saw in app.js. So we'll have export default class, and we'll create a class called input, which is basically a template, and that goes ahead and extends. That means goes ahead and fetches some extra pieces of information and functionality from component or React or component. Alright, now we also have a function. Like I said, functions are basically pockets of information that when executed go ahead and carry out a certain function. Right, and that would be called our render, and in our render we go ahead and return. So what I mean by returning, like we discussed, returning basically goes ahead and says, hey, you're meant to do something and give me back something as a result of doing it. When we type in our calculator, when we go ahead and type 1 + 1, we expect it to return 2, not just calculate 2 and not tell us what it is. So that's the concept of returning back information. Cool. So let's create a view. Within the view, let's go ahead and create our text input. We're creating an instance. If you see over here, all these pointy things that we're doing, we're creating instances. And remember what I said, instances are basically something like it's an instance of a class. So let's say we have our human body, which is a basic anatomy, and then each of us, you, me, someone else, they're all instances of that human body with separate attributes. Our height might be different, our skin color might be different, our gender might be different, all those things There are specific attributes to each particular instance, and those attributes are what we call props, right? Or these tiny values that you saw us passing between the text and the end pointy value or the pointy bracket. Like for our touchable highlight, we had the on press, which is a prop, which is an attribute. Very similarly, for our text input, let's go ahead and type in a few attributes. First thing we're going to say is we want this to be a numeric keyboard, because we know we're just going to have numbers. So let's set it as a numeric keyboard. So I'll say keyboard type, and if you notice, we're doing this entire up and down kind of thing because all the words need to be stuck together. So this is called camel casing, and to that we'll give a string or just another notation, and we'll call it numeric. Now our text input also needs to go ahead and have a value that it needs to go ahead and showcase. And bear with me here, I'll explain all these things very soon. We'll go ahead and set this as this.props.value. I'll explain what that means very soon, don't stress on it. We'll also need something to track changes in text. So whenever I type in, let's say, ABC, I need to be able to understand that, hey, I typed in A, so let me do something with this letter that I typed in. Hey, I typed in B, let me do something. And for us to be able to do that, we can go ahead and basically listen. It's quite literally listening. So when as a human being we're listening for something, we go ahead and respond to it. Very similarly, we're responding for a change in our text. So we can do that by saying on change text. So we're just saying, hey, when the text changes, go ahead and invoke this function that we create. Cool. And then we use this particular notion for creating functions. We have the brackets, which basically receives this information, and then we go ahead and invoke a function, which again I'll explain very soon, that comes through something called this.props.onChange, and then we invoke that function with this information that we just received. Now, I know you might be confused, or might certainly be confused, but trust me, it's not that difficult. It just takes a little time of understanding. So what we're doing over here is we're using this particular notion or this structure for creating a function. The thing that you saw above for the render, for example, that's one way of creating a function. This is just another way of creating a function as well. So whenever there's a change in text, this particular entire function is invoked, and it is invoked, that means it's activated with, or the instruction given to it is a text. So let's say an example is someone says go ahead and get groceries, but obviously you need to know what to get, right? So the function itself is to get groceries, but what to get is what we're invoking it with. In this case, we're saying, hey, there's a change in text, but what is that change? So that change comes inside that text that you see over here. You can call that banana or apples, whatever you want. It's basically just a placeholder. So we have text, and then we go ahead and invoke a function called this.props.onChange text. Cool. And again, I'll explain what this this.props thing means. We don't need to stress too much about it. Awesome. Now we also need to go ahead and set up a button, but before we do that, let's just go ahead and create some styles so that we can see this showcase in our screen. So down at the bottom, let's go ahead and create something very similar to app.js, where we have a constant called styles, and then we do stylesheet.create, which is basically an easy way to go ahead and create styles. It's a very straightforward way of us to go ahead and say, hey, we will have this thing called a container, and that will have some certain colors like background color and this and that, the height, the width, we give it a border, all that fun stuff. Cool. So we have our view. We'll give our view, we'll call our main parent view a container or body or root. Those are usual names given to these things. We'll give it something called a flex1. We'll give it a background color of just white, and we want to align it exactly to the center of the screen. So we'll say align the items to the center and justify it to the center as well. Now what I mean by that, so align items basically means, can you horizontally align the items to the center. And justify content means, can you please go ahead and vertically, justify or align the items to the center of the screen. And flex 1 means nothing but, hey, can you go ahead and give this an entire width, or entire height actually in this case, just take up the entire screen of 1. Cool? Now we have to create our input. So let's go ahead and create our input. I'll go ahead and give it a height. I'll just say 40, width of 300. I'll give it a border color of gray, and we'll give it a border width of 1, just to get things kicked off. I'll go ahead and add those specific attributes to my view and text input using the style prop. You can see these are props that we're sharing. And we should hopefully have these things loaded up on our app when we look at it. Cool. Next thing is we'll talk about this.props.onChange and this.props.value. We'll get the button set up, and then we should be getting there sooner or later. Sweet, see you there. Fantastic. Before we move on with things, first thing we need to do is go to our app.js. Now this is the main file, this is where everything is held, this is where our text was. What we're going to do is go ahead and import this input. As you've seen, we've created that input component in a separate folder structure. It's not in this application, so we somehow need to go ahead and import it. Similar to importing and exporting goods across borders, we need to import something that is able to export itself. So how do we do that? If you go to input.js, you could see that we said export by default this particular class. And that way we're allowing the software to go ahead and export it, and we go ahead and simultaneously import it in our app.js where we want to go ahead and use it. Now remember, we imported a class, which is basically a template. And remember how we spoke about instances? Well, that's what we're going to do. Now, in our view, what we're going to do is create an input instance. And in that input instance, we go ahead and give it props. Props is basically a channel that goes ahead and allows us to pass information from the instance to the relevant template. So, for example, if I go ahead and type in value over here and I give value a string of apples, what that means is if you go to our input.js file, you see where we have this.props.value. Well, that is literally going to be the text that we just gave it. So if I go ahead and in my app.js say value equals oranges, then this.props.value in our input.js is literally going to be oranges. So this.props is basically saying, hey, that pipeline that you have for props for this particular component, I want to get access to the value element. It's as simple as that. So props basically acts as a pipe, think of it to some extent, to go ahead and drip or pass down relevant information or attributable information to a particular class. Cool. So let's go ahead and add 3 props. One is the onChange. So we go ahead and do onChange, and then we just say the value that we get back is going to go ahead and be used to set the state. We'll go through all of this very soon. And just as so, we're going to have a value as well, which is going to do some string. So let's go ahead and set this to this.state.value, and I'll explain that very, very soon. And now, in our app class, let's go ahead and create a state. As we discussed, state is best an object that goes ahead and keeps track of the interactions we as users make with the application. So I'm going to have value, and I'll give it an empty string. Now, let's go ahead and pop open this screen, this diagram. Now see the box on the left, imagine that to be basically our app.js. It has a cloud, that cloud is our state, it has a value of an empty string, and we basically pass that value down to our input component. and our input component receives it using this.props.value. Now, how does the interaction work? Why do we create that value state? What are we even doing? First of all, this is called a control component, which means is we have the state, that particular presence, or that state of mind of that particular input component is controlled by the state that it belongs to, or the state of the class that it belongs to. So it's kind of an interesting cycle that it goes over. So we have this value. When I type in something in my input.js file, let's go to it. When I type in something, the onChange text is invoked. This goes ahead and invokes something called this.props.onChange. And a similar context to this.props.value, I know we're seeing that a lot. If we look at the onChange that we just created, onChange goes ahead and says, take the value that you just received and set the state with this new value. So let's take a second, let's go back into our diagram, and let's look at the cycle. So we have a value for our state, which is for our parent. Our value is dripped down to our input. Whenever there's a change that occurs, when we change the value, that goes ahead and sets a new state for that particular value in the parent, which then mutates the parent, and then React does this whole magical thing of realizing, hey, my state is different, and now things that are referencing or things that are using values of my state need to be compared. I need to see whether the values change, so I can go ahead and reload this part of the component or the website. In our case, the application. And again, it's a cycle, and it goes on and on that way. So every single time I type A, B, and C, the onChange is invoked, the state changes, and then the value becomes A, the value is passed down to the input, then I go ahead and type B, then the onChange is invoked again, but this time it's AB, so the state is then changed to AB, so on and so forth. Cool, so now we've done that, and we understand how this works, and we also had to look into what this.props basically means. It's saying, hey, for the particular properties or the props of this particular input component that we created, let's go ahead and get access to the values that is being fed from the instance. So the instance being app.js, and obviously the input being the class itself that we've created. Awesome. Now that we've created this instance, let's go ahead and save it, and we should be able to see it in our screen. We couldn't see it before because we actually never created an instance. Fantastic. Now, next thing is to go ahead and create a touchable highlight. I'll actually give that exercise to you. Go ahead and try to create a touchable highlight with an onPress. And what we'll end up doing is basically carrying out a simple exercise with that. Alright, I'll see you in the next one. Well, I hope you were able to go ahead and implement the touchable highlight. If you weren't, don't worry about it at all. We'll go through right now. What we're going to do is go back to our input, import the touchable highlight, which is, like we said, an emulation of a button. Create an instance of the touchable highlight. Give it some text or some words so that we know exactly what it is. So in this case, I'm going to call it search, and I'll soon explain why. Well, mainly because we're going to go ahead and search for jokes. And then finish the touchable highlight. Cool. And remember how we used a simple example at the start where touchable highlight responds to something called an onPress? So we're going to do exactly that. We'll say onPress, go ahead and invoke some function. Let's call this fetch data. I'll explain that very soon. Alright. Now, before we go ahead and do that, let's give it a little bit of style. Let's make sure things are good. So our touchable highlight will get a style, and we'll call it styles.button. Note that this hasn't been created yet. We'll go ahead and create it. And the text inside, we'll give it styles.text. Cool. Now let's go all the way to the bottom where we have our style sheet.create, which helps us create our style sheet, our cascading style sheets, or basically the thing that makes things look pretty. Alright, we'll have our button, and then we give our button attributes, very similar to how we've thought about it before. I'm just going to go off the limb here. I'm going to give it a background color of blue. I'm going to give it a height of around 40, width of 100, a border color of gray, border radius of about 5, and we want to make sure that the content is aligned center both vertically as well as horizontally. Take a guess and see what it is and what is what and what's the property for doing that. Well, if you guessed align items and justify content, you're absolutely right. And if you actually remember, I mean, kudos to you, because it takes some time to remember all these things. The next thing is we give the text attribute, and we want our text to look white, so we'll just say color, which is a reference to the color of the text. Give it white. I always wondered why we never called it text color, but that's how it is. That's how things roll. Awesome. We went ahead and did this. Now let's go back and load our application. And we should see something show up that looks like an input, as well as something that goes ahead and has a button. Now, if you click on the button, we'll most likely error, or the application should already be erroring, because we don't have something called this.fetchData, which we created for our touchable highlight. So let's go ahead and create a function called fetchData, like we did before for our button, where we did a function for onClick. Cool, so we create fetchData, and all fetchData does right now is gets access to the value, the same value that our input is, and it just console logs it. Remember, console log is nothing but a way of actually going ahead and logging or seeing, having visual access to us as engineers and developers to that particular value. So it shows on our screen. We can get to see, hey, what is actually inside this value. Cool. So let's just go ahead and do that and let the app be. Alright, let's reload our application. You can reload the application doing Command R, and most of the times it should automatically reload for you. Cool. And once the app is reloaded, let's go ahead and do a click on the button, and we should be seeing a console log. Well, right now it would be empty, so let's go ahead and type something in, and we should be able to see a console log of the value that we typed in. Awesome. Let's go ahead and implement the next part, which is actually getting data from our API. Let's look at this diagram. What is an API request? An API request is nothing but a request that's made across the internet to go ahead and fetch some data. When you go to your Facebook website, all you're doing is going ahead and asking Facebook to send some information, an HTML document, information regarding your friends, information regarding friends' interaction with other content. It's an API request. You're just making a request to some point on the web to go ahead and fetch some information. What we're going to do is, when we type in the number in our input field and we press the button, we want to go ahead and make a request to a database that is the Jokes API, and that database is going to go ahead and, based on the request we make, return some information to us in a list of information, a list of data. So when we go ahead and type in 5, click the button, we're going to go ahead and make a request to an API, which we will type down, that goes ahead and asks to go ahead and fetch 5 different jokes from its database to send back to us. So how do we do this? Let's switch screens onto our code. Let's look at our input.js file. In our fetch data function, we already have access to the value because we've been console logging it. Instead, we're going to go ahead and fetch. Like I said, sometimes programming is quite literally just English. We're fetching some data. So I go ahead and put these backticks. They are available in the top left corner of a MacBook Pro keyboard. I type in http://api.icndb.com/jokes/random, and then the end part I do slash. I'll tell you what this is. I put a dollar value, I put a curly open bracket, a curly close bracket, and I type in this.props.value. Now this is an easy and cool way of going ahead and concatenating. Or what concatenating means is joining two things together. So we're basically concatenating this string that we have, or this text, which is the http api.icndb.com/jokes/random, with this dynamic value. You know, this.props.value can change. The rest of it is static. This can change based on what we type in. We're going to do fetch. We're going to fetch some information, and then what do we do after we fetch it? Like I said, quite literal English. We do a dot then, which basically takes in another function. We're saying we're going to get some response. We want to convert that response to what we refer to as JSON. What JSON means is JavaScript object notation. Again, I encourage you to continuously repeat these videos and try to understand it, but what JSON basically means is, hey, I'm getting some information. I need to make sure my computer understands it. Can you please convert it into a type that I understand? The type that I understand is something called JavaScript object notations. What that means is we're going to go ahead and convert our code into objects. And like we discussed, objects are nothing but key value pairs. It's just a dictionary. Each key has a value. You know, flower basically means something that grows on a plant. Seed is basically something that goes ahead and helps grow new fruits. I'm just giving rough examples here. Alright, and we're going to go ahead and return this information. And then once this information is returned, we want to go ahead and update our state from our parent. We want to go ahead and take this value and go ahead and do something with it. And remember, the input goes ahead and does nothing but pretty much just display information. We don't want to go ahead and do some internal processing over here. But for now, let's go ahead and say, then let's just go ahead and console log the data. Cool. Once we do that, hopefully everything's working nice and neat. Let's go to our app. In our app, let's type in 5, 4, 3, whichever number you like. Click on the button. Let's go to our terminal. And if everything went nice and clean, we should have some information back. And you can see, there we go, we're getting some exciting data back now. We're actually getting information from that database. Now what do we want to do? We want to take this information from this database, store it somewhere, and then tell our what we're going to create as our Tinder swipe card system, hey, I received new jokes. Can you please go ahead and load them one by one, so me as a user can go ahead and swipe left and right as to if I like it or not. Cool? Alright, so I'll see you in the next one where we're going to go ahead and just update our parent state. Remember, just the same way we went ahead and updated our value for our input all the way in the parent, because we're working through a single source of truth. That's ideally very good programmatic practice. Is you don't want to have 2 points of reference to the same thing. You want to have information coming all from one singularity point, so that whenever we're growing a huge application, we all know where this information is originating from. Okay, I'll see you in the next one. Awesome. Congrats on getting so far. I hope that you're getting the gist of how we're doing these things. Now, following a similar principle, like I said, of how we went ahead and did this input field, where we typed something that went all the way to our parent, and that information came back down. We're going to do something very similar for the new jokes that we received. I'll tell you why. So let's go ahead, let's go to our app.js. In our state, let's go ahead and create a new attribute called jokes and give it these square bracket notations. All these square brackets mean is, hey, we're going to create a list, or what we refer to as an array. An array refers to just an array of information, so just be prepared. Cool. And then in our input, we're going to go ahead and create a new prop and say update jokes. Now, update jokes goes ahead and takes a new function, and that function's main focus point is to go ahead and set the state with the information it receives, which is basically the jokes. Now let's marry all this together and see what exactly is happening. Alright, now the reason why we go ahead and use props to go ahead and update the jokes is because we don't want to create our Tinder component or that particular card swipe component inside our input component. That's not the purpose. We actually want to go ahead and create that in our app.js, which is more of like a global holding structure, which holds various different components. It has the input component. We can go ahead and even remove the button and put it inside the app.js component, and we can even go ahead and add now what we'll do as our Tinder component. So this is a way of sharing information. Think of it as like a bounce. So if I want to go ahead and communicate from one room to another room, what I basically do is I create an intercom system where I have my phone, which connects to like a master port. That master port then goes ahead and lets me connect to another phone. You see, so every room is basically connected to that master port. In this case, every room can be thought of as a component, and that master port can be thought of our app.js. It's basically the parent which lets to kids who aren't who are fighting with each other basically talk. They act as an intermediary. So the input goes ahead, receives information, sends that to our app.js. Once it sends it, then that goes ahead and updates the state, and now anything that is added in our app.js can go ahead and get access to that joke or the list of jokes that we received and then play with it. Cool. So if you are venturing, congratulations. If you haven't, no worries. What I'm basically going to do is in the part where we're console logging, I'll just say now we fetch the data, then we've gone ahead and done this conversion to something called a JSON object notation, which lets us go ahead and understand that data in the form of an object. Then we're going to take this data and then update our parent's state by doing this.props.update jokes with the value of the data that we received. And if you look at a terminal, you'll see that we have an object, and in that object the array of jokes are in an attribute called value. It's not directly through data, unfortunately. It's something from within the data in an attribute called value. Cool. Now that value has been updated and it's in our parent app state, and now we have access to go ahead and pass this information to another component. Alright, now before I go into the next one, I feel like you can definitely go ahead and revise some of the information we've gone through, because now what I'd like you to do before we start the next lecture is two things. Go ahead and create a new component, and let's call it card swipe, or let's call it the Tinder component, whichever one you like. We'll keep it flexible. And within that component, let's go ahead and import React, React component. Let's go ahead and import our style sheet. Let's import our text and our view. Let's import all these things. And then what I want us to do is create 3 separate classes within that particular file. Our first class is basically going to be our Tinder card, right? The purpose of the card is to go ahead and receive information, just text, just the joke itself, and goes ahead and displays it. So ideally, we're just looking at creating a class that renders, uses the render function to return a view, and within the view we have text, and within the text all we're doing is referencing the particular joke. So we'll say this.props.joke because we'll be feeding it a joke. And then I also want us to go ahead and create another class for a component that we will say no cards component. And this is a situation where we run out of jokes. We need to still show our user that, hey, there are no more jokes. So let's go ahead and create another class or an instance component that basically goes ahead and has a very similar structure, a view. It goes ahead and has text inside it, and this text obviously has nothing to do with props, The only thing it'll say is, hey, no more cards, go fetch some more data. Straightforward, right? Cool, just set those two things up, and the third one we'll go ahead and do together, and we will do the first two as well, but try venture and get this sorted. Cool, see you in the next one. Well, I really hope you're able to give that a shot. But if you haven't, don't worry. We're going to go ahead and create those classes and elements and sections again. Alright, so let's start off. In our components folder, let's go ahead and create a new folder. Let's call that Tinder. Cool. Within that, in a similar structure, we're going to go ahead and create a file, and I'm going to call that Tinder.js. Sweet. Now again, for the ease of time, I'm just going to go over and place elements from different files, but obviously we'll make sure we understand everything. So I'm going to import this part over here, just Command C and paste that in. So we're importing React, which is what we're going to use from our React modules. We're also going to import a few bits and pieces from here. I'm just going to copy the whole thing from our input, but when I paste it, I'm going to delete these two because we're not going to need them. Alright, now that we've done this, what are we going to do? First thing, or the first point of exercise, was to create a class called card. So let's go ahead and create a class. Let's call it card, and we know that extends react.component. Now remember, if we did the dot notation, it was also to prove that React over here is an object. That means React also has other attributes attached to it, component being one of them, which we're going to derive some extra functionality from. Now we go ahead and utilize our render function, which is actually what we get from our component, which we want to return some data from. What are we returning over here? We're going to return a view, and the whole purpose of the view is to go ahead and hold some text. Let's go ahead and say text, and the job of the text is to basically hold the joke, and we're going to assume the joke is going to come down via props from our app over here. That means our app is going to hold a little Tinder component, which is going to go ahead and pass down this joke down, the list of jokes. So I can easily go ahead and do this.props.jokes, right? I can do that. Now one would think that this would actually go ahead and maybe get that joke, or let's just actually say joke, from my prop. That's not the case, because let's look at app.js. Anything that I put in between my text is literally things that we printed out in our component. Whoops, I realize that I made this mistake over here that says can't access state from whichever component you want, which is this over here. I can't actually go ahead and place a comment section, so let me go ahead and delete that, save it, and let's try to reload our application, and boom, we have it on. So you see our text over here and our text over here. That is actually holding our raw text. So maybe if I go ahead and delete this and do this.props. Just something, it's actually going to give us the props that is labeled something. If I load my app, it actually prints out the actual text. Now how do I get the value that is this.props.something, or in the case of our Tinder application, this.props.joke? Well, we do that, or we actually validate or verify something to be a variable as to something that is actually a string. A variable is obviously something that holds some data, which would be this.props.joke, by surrounding it with curly brackets. These curly brackets basically go ahead and prove that this particular component over here is holding on to some dynamic information. Okay, now let's go ahead and create another class, and I'm going to call that class no more cards. And the reason I call it this is because we want to go ahead and show this class when there's no more cards present or no more jokes present. So we're going to go ahead and extends react.component in a similar manner. It also has a render function which also returns something, and that is going to be a view, and that is also going to be a view. Now in the case of this, we really don't care about it having any props. We literally wanted to go ahead and say no more jokes. And this would be the prompt for us to go ahead and actually return this little information here and say, okay, there's no more jokes, so time for me to go ahead and load some more jokes, or just close the application. But hopefully we want to go ahead and load some more jokes. Cool, now that we've done that, works fine. But what are we doing all this for? We're doing this for a reason that we're going to use a particular node module. That node module is what we call React Native Tinder swipe cards. Cool. Now, React Native Tinder swipe cards is what we're going to get our functionality for our Tinder application from. So over here, if you look at the docs, there's a fair bit of docs that we can go through. The documents basically go ahead and tell us the different functionalities and what we can get out of it, what prop we can pass down, and what it's meant to be. So remember how I said the cards are going to be an array? So that's where I got this from. And remember how I said we need to have two things. One is to go ahead and show the actual joke, and one card when there's no more jokes. So that's for this one. Rendered no more cards is what we're going to invoke, or what is going to be invoked when there are no more cards left for the application to show. Now you can find that over here in github.com/meteor-factory React Native Tinder swipe cards. Cool. All right, now let's go back to our app over here, and in our app we want to go ahead and add a little bit of style. Our card needs to look or have some little class. So let's do that before we jump any further in. So let's do const, and I'll say styles, and that is going to be style sheet dot create, and we're going to give just a basic card component. Cool. And our card component has to have a few attributes. We're going to give it a width of 300. We want it to be a square. We're going to give it a height of 300 as well. We're going to go ahead and have a border radius of 10. Maybe give it a border color of, let's see. I really like this border color from my company 521. We make mobile apps, as you may know, and the color that I picked off was this one. And I'm just going to copy that. I'm going to go back and paste it in. Now the color, for those who are wondering, is EA394B, but you can decide whatever border color you want. It really doesn't matter. And we're also going to go ahead and set up a border width and give it a border width of 2. Actually, I'm also going to give it a background color, and that background color, let's go ahead and set the background color of our cards to be, and again, this is off my head, and I know this color by hearted, but I'll go with 04B1FF. Really don't need to know how I got this color. This is just the color I had by hearted from before. Don't stress on it. But yeah, we set up some basic attributes, and I'm also going to give it a flex of 1 to get that complete height. And I want to make sure the text that I get, the joke that I display, is pretty much in the center of the card. So how did we do that before? Yes, if you get justify content and set that to center, and align items and set that to center, we pretty much have a winner. Fantastic, we've got that going. You don't need to really stress on how I know all these things. It just comes with practice. But knowing that the basics of any attribute, that has or any element that has a width and a height, and as well as a border radius, we can get the rough gist of what the more generic attributes or styles of a particular element are. But feel free to go ahead and explore everything else that's around for us to go ahead and create with. Alright, so I've gone ahead and done that. We've created jokes, no more jokes. Now let's actually go ahead and create the class. Oh wait, right before I do that, why did we create this? To actually create the card style. So I'm going to go ahead and do that and say style equals styles.card. Cool. We've actually done that. Now I need to go ahead and also do one for when we have no more cards. we'll leave it the same for now. Style equals styles.card. Now, these styles are very experimental. I'm not a designer by any sense, so I really encourage you to go ahead and experiment with your own styles and paste your results in the comment section on the right side or wherever you're looking at this from. I'll be really keen to see what you create. Cool. So now that we've done that, let's actually go ahead and create our main component, our main Tinder component. So prior to doing that, there are a few things that we need to execute. First thing is we actually need to go ahead and install this. And how do we install it? We install it straightforward. Look at the docs. It says npm install React Native swipe cards. So again, for the safety of time, I've gone ahead and done that. So I've opened the new terminal, right? Ignore this error that I got over here. I've opened a new terminal and I've done npm install React Native swipe cards. So react-native-swipe-cards. Gone ahead and done that. Cool. Now once that's done, gone back, my app is running safely, which is good. Ideally, also want to go ahead and kill this and start it again so that it can now absorb this new module that we've installed. All right? Fantastic. Now, main thing, just like we've done before, where we've actually imported all these style sheets and elements from our modules, we also need to go ahead and import the thing that you would have just installed, which I'm going to call swipe cards. And that would be from my React Native swipe cards module that I would find in my node modules if I dug deep enough. All right. Cool. Let's create our main class. It's going to be export default because this is a main class that we're going to export. So export default class Tinder extends react.component. Cool. And in this we're going to have, again, like all the other components, a render function which returns some information. In this case, we're going to go ahead and return our main swipe cards, which we just imported up top. So let's create an instance of it, call it swipe cards, and let's close it. To this, I'm going to pass in a few props. And the first prop that I'm going to pass in is the cards itself. I am going to assume, or I will know that this cards that we get is basically going to come from my parent state. You know, all the jokes that were saved over here, the jokes that we saved through the update jokes, because we're setting our state with the new jokes. I am going to go ahead and assume that this props.jokes is actually where I'm going to go ahead and get my cards from. Cool. Now we need to go ahead and do a few more things. Now, these things are coming straight from the docs and the explanation provided to us from the docs itself. Now, the docs also go ahead and state that we need to have a few views. One to actually show each and every single joke. Now, how do we do that? We pass it a prop called render card, which needs to take in a function. So each and every single joke that we get access to goes ahead and is pushed through this function. So let's call this, let's call it a joke. And we set this card over here, which is pretty much what we're going to invoke. So we need to go ahead and say card, right? Now this joke is a reciprocation, or it represents each and every single joke one at a time from the list of jokes that we will pass down from our app. This would be one joke at a time. So we have our joke over here. And we've also said we'll get access to that in our card element that we just created, card template, through something called list.props.joke. Cool? All happy dandy? Awesome. Now that we've said that, let's go ahead and do something. Let's go ahead and say joke equals joke. Simple as that. Right? Now I just want to go ahead and travel back to here and see whether we had our, there we go, we had our list of jokes. And remember, this is actually what we're going to set our state with. Now if you look at our input, you see that when our jokes are updated, we're doing it with data.value. So if I go back to my terminal, this is my data, as you can see. My value is this array. Now our array is a list of objects, and in that object the joke is in this attribute called joke. So it's like joke within a joke kind of thing. So we need to go ahead and get access to this element. So that means within each object we need to do dot joke to get access to it. And remember what I said in our Tinder.js file over here, this joke represents pretty much this entire object over here for us. And we don't need the whole object, we pretty much just need just this part of the joke. So I'm just going to go directly and say joke dot joke, which will represent this exact string. To make our life easy and confuse us less, I'm going to change this to joke object. I'm going to copy this, paste it here. Now we know that this whole thing can be our joke object. Cool. Now that we've done this, let's go ahead and revisit this and continue it in the next lecture because this is getting too long. So far what we've done is gone ahead and created a Tinder class, gone ahead and imported our swipe cards, and we've gone ahead and created or passed down some props of our jokes, as well as created an instance to render our card. Cool. We also need to go ahead and handle a situation where there are no more cards. So render no more cards. It's a prop that we pass in. This also supposedly takes in a function which we go ahead and return our class that we created before, which is for no more cards. Now remember, this needs no props because all it does is pretty much return a view that says no more cards. And how do I know this again? It's just pretty much from reading the docs. You see that there's no more cards over here. Sweet. We also need to go ahead and handle a situation where, you know, someone swipes right and someone swipes left. What happens, right? And they've done this in a pretty fun way, I guess. We need to handle a situation where someone says handle yup. And I'm just going to say this dot handle accept and a handle nope. And this is going to be this dot handle reject. And again, all from the docs, handle yup and handle nope, as you can see. Cool. Now obviously these are functions that don't exist, so it would error out. So I'll just go ahead and temporarily create these functions. I will say handle accept, and I'm going to go ahead and do something like this, which all it does is console.log I like this joke, and handle reject, all it goes and does to console.log don't like this joke. Oops, don't like this joke, and close it with the string. Alright, so we've done this and this. Now we've coded a lot without actually seeing this being implemented, so let's give this a shot. So I'm going to go ahead and save this. Cool. See if okay, that's still running, so that's good. Everything's saved. Now, obviously, let's take a guess as to why nothing shows over here. Well, for those who guessed right, it's because we didn't import anything into our app in our main view to showcase it. So let's do it in this very similar way. Import, and I'm going to call it Tinder from the same folder structure. Components slash Tinder slash Tinder. And again, notice as this dot slash basically means in the same folder level, because you see app.js is here, in the same folder level we have components, and then we go into Tinder, and then we go into Tinder. Cool, we've done that. Now all we pretty much have to do is instantiate our Tinder app. So let's do that over here. I'm going to go ahead and delete this now. We really don't need it anymore. I'll say Tinder, oops, capital Tinder, close it. And now that I've closed it, remember, Tinder gets jokes from the props. And where do our jokes come from? They actually come from our state. So I'm going to say jokes, close this, dot state, dot jokes, as such. I also did state that my input goes ahead and has a flex of 1. Now I want my cards to be quite big, take up a decent size of the screen, so I am going to say, I'm going to give this a style. So I will give it a style, and I will call it styles.tinder. Obviously this doesn't exist. Let's go ahead and create that, and I will say Tinder, and this would now be a flex of 2. Alright, now save that, save this. Let's hope this loads our application. Whoops, we have an error saying no more jokes must be wrapped in an explicit text component. So what does that mean? Oh, you see that over here? I did view, but I actually never returned text. So let me actually go ahead and close that. Let's do text as such. And go ahead and paste that in. See, that's the error here, because this was actually text and we had to go ahead and wrap it in text. Cool. Straight off the bat, it says no more jokes, and obviously the style is a little clunky. Let's go ahead and fix that straight away, and I will say Tinder, let's just give it a flex of 1. Reload our application. Okay, it's still doing that. We'll fix this, but okay. No more jokes set up for us. Let's type in the number 5. Let's click search. Boom! We're actually loading in jokes. Chuck Norris doesn't want wash his clothes. He dissed them. Okay. I'm sorry if some of these jokes are rated PG, because I don't actually control the content. So if you ever see something, please forgive me. It's part of the API. Now I can actually swipe left and right. As you can see, we have the nope and yup showing. So let's say if I swipe right, what happens? Another joke shows up. If I look at my terminal, scroll down, it actually says I like this joke. So let's actually do this. If I swipe left, I don't like this joke. I like this joke. I don't like this joke. Awesome. So you've actually gone ahead and created your very own first React Native application. We just need to go ahead and fix the styling, which we'll do in the last lesson. I'll see you right there. Alright, so I realized where the mistake was made. First of all, you know how I've set the style over here to styles.tinder. Now since this is not a native element, that means it's not something we're pulling in from React Native. This would actually pose in as a prop. Now with our Tinder file, there is nowhere over here where I'm handling a prop called this.props.style, which is what this actually refers to. This would actually would make no difference in our life. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that. And this poses no justification to exist as well. So I'm going to go ahead and save that. And you see, nothing's changed. So a good way to go ahead and examine what's happening is in a MacBook, you can do Command D, and it would open up something like this. And I assume in Windows it would be similar with Control D or Shift Control D. We'll have to explore that. And over here, I'm going to do something called Toggle Element Inspector. I'm going to actually inspect it to see what styles are applied. So if I click on this, you can see there's a width of 100, height of 300. Basically, all the styles that we gave are Tinder card. All these styles. Correct? And then if I click on my input, weirdly enough, there's no styles attached to it. I look over here and I'm like, hold on. Styles of container actually has a container, and I have a container over here. Then I realize there's a small mistake. I spelled it as container, which is wrong. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that and save it as container. And for those of you who saw that and been screaming at the screen from the beginning, I apologize. So I will save that, load it in, and there we go. It's our app is loaded nicely. I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing, Command D, and toggle inspect the element inspector, get rid of it. Now obviously this shows no more jokes, so I want to go ahead and actually segregate that. I do not want the same style for my no more jokes. I'm just, for the moment, just going to get rid of it, reload our app, and cool, it just says no jokes to show. Delete that and say no jokes to show. Boom, so no jokes to show. Now I'll go ahead and type in 5, click search, and boom, we have our jokes loaded in. And we can just pretty much go left and right, and it basically says no, you don't like the joke, and yes, you like the joke. And this is reflected in our terminal. So congratulations, you've actually gone ahead and built your first mobile application, and I hope you've had a great time doing so and you've learned a lot from doing this. A little more about myself.